Hello and welcome to episode 9 of In Pursuit of Clarity, entitled On the Subjectivity of Frames and Narratives. Firstly, I wanted to apologize for the slowed pace since the holidays. I may need to drop the pace down to approximately one per week for at least a while. I'm having to find solutions to stay afloat as I work to make this viable and sustainable. I'll continue aiming for 2 per week, and I'll make sure to not let it drop below an average of at least 1 submission per week at minimum, and I hope to be back to 2 per week with consistency soon. So I wanted to elaborate a bit on a concept I touched on in my discussion with JF the other day, which I've linked to below. I'd mentioned the importance of frames and lenses through which we see the world, and how these can be far more important than the specifics we see through them, because they both help determine what we see and just how we see it. This goes back to the topic of the very first podcast and the importance of pulling back. It's only in the pulling back that we're able to see this lens for what it is. And to assure we're on the same page, you might think of a lens as a narrative or a storyline, a premise or context we then use to interpret and sort and classify information from the outside world. One example of how framing is used to great effect in our era is the productions of our controlled press. Most agree they're a manipulative and deceitful force, but we don't all see this manipulation and deception occurring in the same way. Providing misleading or mischaracterized or exaggerated answers to various questions is an example of manipulation, but I'd argue the far more powerful form of manipulation often hides in the asking of the questions in the first place, because the posing of a question to the viewer is the creation of this frame. To give an example, you'll note that CNN loves to tout its factualness, and in a sense, they're correct to do so. They'll rarely cite a specific statistic incorrectly and claim that 7 died in a bomb blast when it was actually 4, or anything of this nature. They're far too smart for this and wouldn't take the risk. What they do instead is vastly more effective. They'll often present an extremely loaded question in the most subtle manner possible, and then cause panel discussion within this frame. They may say something like, were Trump's flippant and aggressive remarks helpful or harmful to America's reputation on the world stage? The moment the listener does anything but balk at such a leading question, they're now locked into this framework of Trump having been flippant and aggressive, which hints at him being several other things, which the mind automatically infers subconsciously. Perhaps flustered, unprofessional, unbalanced, childish, etc. It also locks the listener into an obvious answer, because after all, whose flippant and aggressive remarks ever helped their cause? But it goes deeper than this. They get to choose the framing of focusing on these specific remarks, of presumably a much longer speech or discussion, as if it were the most newsworthy bit. And this is the real power of the media, and what so many on the left seem to completely fail to recognize when they mindlessly parrot the concept that the media just reports on Trump factually. In the most strict sense of that word, they usually do. As mentioned a moment ago, they're not going to voice any provably false black and white lie, and they don't need to. One could follow around the most saintly person on the face of the earth for a few years and create a compilation of only their most crude or offensive or ignoble moments and cause them to appear like monsters to anyone viewing the footage. Is this a factual representation? Yes, in the most technical sense. But the frame or premise they're attempting to create is intrinsically dishonest. It's not an accurate representation. And these frames of reference have a way of spreading like wildfire. Their adoption becomes contagious. So I use the media here as the first example to illustrate a larger point. Our entire reality is a bit like a set of nested frames. Those who accept a given framework are able to see the smaller ones within it, and the still smaller ones within those, and so on. Each of these building as a cumulative to create a storyline. The more we zoom in and follow these storylines further down their rabbit hole, the more we're prone to forget that they're just subjectively created. Sigmund Freud decided to view nearly all of human psychology through the lens of sex and sexual desire, and enough of his peers chose to adopt his speculations and have circled the wagons and built upon his foundation. And this has become much of what we know as psychology today, despite the constructs of Carl Jung seeming far more valid to many. The Frankfurt School helped reorient all of academia in the West, moving us from learning hard sciences and languages and real history and actually useful skill sets to learning how to deconstruct and destroy orderly societies. And we've been taught to call this education. And viewed from a certain perspective, it could be considered as such. Those men who helped introduce dissonance and disharmony in art and music created a frame through which only pieces that fit this mold were deemed to be fresh and exciting and worthy of note. And millions still make use of this frame today. The prevailing myths that act as the foundations and spiritual driving forces of peoples and cultures are also frames on a still broader level. The America as anti-Nazi savior of the world from certain destruction was one of these foundational myths that certain forces have worked extremely hard to help gain purchase in the collective psyche with great success. These broadest of frameworks serve to shape the way entire nations and all the individuals within them think about themselves and their relation to the world. And when they're consciously created from the ground up, this is often their point, to be a shepherding mechanism, to better herd or control populations and direct their energies. I should state openly at this point that I do believe these processes are conscious. To what extent we want to call this a conspiracy versus some organic outgrowth of a racial archetype or a deep-seated driving force is up to the listener to decide, since I think this point is largely one of semantics, and there's no firm and clear dividing line between an official and formally written out and agreed upon conspiracy and a group of people acting in concert in their own collective best interest and against those of others. But I do believe there have existed men whose purpose was to shape individuals, nations, and cultures without their recognition of this shaping force. And this all speaks to the concept of the big lie popularized after World War II. And ironically, although our age likes to attribute it to the Nazis and Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, as if this was one of their foundational strategies to get one over on the German people, in actuality it was a concept highlighted by the National Socialist thinkers that they accused the Marxists of their day of making use of. It's the idea of a lie so big, so audacious and shameless, that it ends up being believed because most people aren't capable of fathoming that such dishonesty is even possible, that anyone could have the nerve. It's my contention that many of the frames adopted since World War II are exactly this, namely big lies. One might point to the wholesale denial of the biological conception of race as one of these. In fact, of the tens of thousands of scientific and biological works authored over the years discussing race and races and their differences, in the face of obvious physical and mental differences that would take hours to fully elaborate, in the face of definitive genetic differences that can't be argued away, a man named Franz Boas had the nerve to simply state, No, I don't think race exists at all. Because his peers rather liked this notion, especially after the Nazi era, they devoted their time and intellectual energies into further building out this foundation, and this big lie is now at the root of a sprawling chaos and confusion in our modern age. It's now to the point where hospitals may no longer be able to use invaluable racial and genetic data to save lives, because through the very act of doing so, they're disproving this big lie. And the myth and its cultural ramifications matter more to certain powerful interests than human lives. So I say all this to make the point that it helps to be cognizant of the frames we're operating within, and always be careful not to adopt a profoundly dishonest or inaccurate larger frame, and then proceed to have arguments or debates or waste intellectual energies mulling over those ideas within the smaller frames nested within it. This isn't easy in the least. It requires not only extra thought and time and attention, but a more independent style of thinking, and one in which everything is approached in the manner of a detective, a skeptic in the truest form of that word, who doesn't take anything for a given. None of this is meant to hint at relativity, or to insinuate that this world is lacking in truthful constructs or perspectives. It's merely to say that the frames we've adopted over the past several decades have led us astray from a far more natural and objectively correct manner of viewing our reality. And that because there are levels and layers to this confusion, it can often be difficult to find our way back out of the mess. And this analogous way of viewing the layers of deception we've been locked into might be helpful to keep in mind. Beware the big lie, and strive to recognize and destroy those frames, and seek out that big truth that helps set the world in harmonious order. And that is all. Thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our elaborate plans. The end of everything that stands. The end, no safety.